Why the US is collapsing, the coming economic crisis. In the latter part of the 2000s, the US economy was expanding, the quality of living was superb, the markets were surging, and the nation had an acceptable inflation rate of 3%. It suggested that people might unwind since the economy was stable. The US seemed unstoppable and its citizens could afford to live well, but after a series of poor decisions, inflation rates skyrocketed. 40% of all US currencies were manufactured by the US government in just this year, and 2021 with a peak of 9%. The standard of living is drastically declining, and an increasing number of individuals are having difficulty providing for their families, maintaining their houses, and affording healthcare. American household savings are shrinking, big banks are failing, and housing costs are rising swiftly. The US economy is experiencing a significant fall, which is now widely known. There's a reason why multiple huge firms like Amazon, Meta, and Google are laying off tens of thousands of workers. US national debt is also very high, surpassing 120% of what the US makes in a year. And so, what were the reckless actions that caused this? Who and what decisions were made that caused the current US economic collapse? Well, we're going to outline all the mistakes that made this a reality. It all started after the 2008 financial crash. You see, prior to 2008, banks had found a way to profit greatly by making huge wagers on the housing markets, but as soon as the danger began to materialize, it led to the precipitous drop in property values and, eventually, a recession that had an impact on the entire country. The worldwide recession that followed the US economic calamity has hurt everyone. The global financial system is anchored by the US economy, as the 2008 financial crisis served as a stark reminder. Everyone was impacted as it started to break apart. According to these standards, the financial crisis of 2008 alone completely wrecked the economies of countries like Greece and sent millions of people into extreme poverty all over the world. The United States handled the 2000 accident harshly despite how catastrophic it was. In spite of the fact that other currencies were in freefall at the time, the economy seems to be stable as of 2008 after regulatory measures were put into place. Financial systems all around the world turned to the US for safety while it was in crisis, but they face many challenges in the future owing to the dollar's long-term decline, the fallout from the crash, and everything else that highlighted the US's comparative strength. The unhealed wounds from the Great Recession are what contributed to the US economy's downfall in the first place. The 2008 financial crisis was one of the long-term effects of the Great Recession. It gave the US a massive amount of debt, as the US government decided to bail out the banks that actually caused the crisis in the first place. To do this, they needed lots of money, and this added to the massive national debt figure between 2007 to 2009. The nations that saw their costs rise by an astounding 20% in comparison to their GDP didn't see this as a major problem with the crisis, despite the fact that the US had been driven dead from the Middle East for years to come. I mean, simply the war on terror alone is estimating of expenses. When the crisis was over, the debt had reached 90% of the country's GDP, which is strikingly comparable to the Great Recession, which was also characterized by a significant rise in the national debt. The United States had to pay all of these outrageously high amounts, including $1 trillion, to be the world's superpower. Long-term improvements were not possible, although at the time it didn't seem that way because the US economy appeared to be slowly emerging from the recession and the GDP started to increase once more. This was the hardest part of the recovery process from the shock. Eventually reached 80% of the nation's GDP, meaning that relative to the heights of the Great Depression, the US owed more money. The United States seemed to be in a good shape, and after a few years its economy was back on track. However, before we continue, kindly like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel. These were the number of important underlying problems, the first one being inequality. Now, as we all know, there's a very small group of powerful people at the top that caused the crash. Those people would be betting at the masses' retirement and life savings at the expense of everyone with their reckless actions. A reverse change in the US on-board economy, but when the economy began to grow again, the people at the top of the most profits because unlike the Great Depression, there was no new due. Instead, the focus this time was put on restoring the old system which had been dysfunctional in the first place. That will trickle down economics and lead to a massive rising inequality. Now, the US was incredibly unequal before the crash. This is posted for the capitalism, and that isn't necessarily bad. However, after the crash, these gaps kept on growing. That led into the point where the top 1,000s of countries were worth more than the bottom 90, giving the richest Americans massive amounts of power and influence. Number 2, unemployment. In spite of the economic collapse, the world and the state have suffered depression. Before the crash, unemployment was about 5%, doubling just a few months after the crash, and as the economy slowed, it started to shrink. Companies kept laying people off, hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost every month, and this went on for years. Unemployment and job progress levels in 2016, but by then it was too late. Damage should be done to the American psyche, and storms brewing on the citizens. The US was still peaceful and the economy was recovering. On paper, it seemed like everything was just going back to normal. The wealth inequality was growing and the Occupy Wall Street movement's budgets Occupy Wall Street protest enters its third week. It started as less than a dozen college students camping out in a park, and the New York Stock Exchange is now hundreds of protesters, and it spread to the other states. Much larger macroeconomic forces were stuffed to threaten the US, and the root of this problem was that people were just getting too old. People won't have enough babies anymore, or the state of this country may be influencing a record number of Americans against having children, with the baby boomer generation been lodged in the US with this generation that almost all in retirement, and as birth rates continue to drop, just lots and lots of people need to be taken care of. Mortgage rates in the United States have more than doubled in the last year, prohibiting millions of Americans from purchasing a home. Tens of millions of Americans resigned from their jobs during the height of the pandemic, a phenomenon known as the Great Resignation. According to recent data released, the number of job openings in the United States has decreased by 1.1 million, while jobless claims have increased more than expected. The unemployment rate, on the other hand, fell to half a century low of 3.5% in September, indicating a strong job market. Number 3. War between Ukraine and Russia. Collision of economic, financial, and political calamities has never been more visible than in the United Kingdom. The United States, like the rest of the world, has been dealing with increased expenses primarily as a result of the massive shock of COVID-19 following the trade disruptions created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Energy costs have increased and supplies have decreased as the West has cut off Russian natural gas shipments. The Ukraine crisis, increasing inflation, and higher interest rates are fueling worries that the US economy is about to enter a slump. Several credible economic indicators suggest that the US economy is in peril. Those incidents were horrible in and of themselves. In the world, jobs for plenty opportunity was everywhere, and America's industrial strength was an all-time high, but history took its course. These jobs are slowly outsourced to other countries like China, and over the latter half of the 20th century, the heart of America corpsed, and the poor with these job opportunities tied up, and people left for more prosperous coasts and to live there when the crash happened. In fact, it was one of the most wealthy cities in the entire world, but over time, as companies outsourced all of their labor to these foreign nations, places like Detroit became barren wasteland, and after the crash, they fell just even further behind it. It took almost 10 years for the city's economy to recover to pre-crush levels, and even that pre-crush levels were substantially lower than before, and so of course, with this economic decline, that is that much of Americans feel disenfranchised. They feel left behind in America's growth, and all of this was happening. Rent costs everywhere gradually going on, affordable housing extremely hard to find unless you're cool with life. In the 2010, they went up by 7%, and since they've never recovered. Instead of what they've earned, you continue to rise more and more each year, and all these combining factors, less jobs, more expensive housing matters, disenfranchised people, declining cities, and high living costs, all of these economic factors were working against the people at the bottom. And this was happening in the more affluent parts of the country. It didn't seem to tell what they ignored. Impoverished region tried the Midwest, and people were really angry, and so when the time came for an election and 60 million people in those reign could not do anything, and they could not fly other states, made their voices heard, and they were angry. The lack of jobs, the rising inequality, and the general economic depravity, and so people don't love the country then. According to the World Bank, the COVID-19 outbreak and the war in Ukraine have caused extraordinary shocks to the global economy, and progress toward eliminating extreme poverty by 2030 has effectively stalled. The World Bank estimates that the number of people living on $2.5 per day will increase by 11% in 2020, from 648 million to 719 million. The United Nations has warned that a worldwide economic crisis might be worse than the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 COVID-19 shock. It's clear to everyone that we're going to go into one of the deepest recessions of history, but it only gets worse from the US is going to have to deal with the desperation that comes from a recession. There'll be more crime or mental illness, more drug addiction, and more importantly, more critical radicalization. As we see in the world right now, people are becoming more and more divided, more full of hate for one another. The original binding spot, the communities that define America, now being decimated, and so it should be clear to everyone that things aren't really looking good.